Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe.
And I'm Sunny. So glad you're here with us.
Yeah, great to have you tuning in.
We're about to jump into some really fascinating stuff today. It's information we've been looking at. And honestly, some of it is pretty uncomfortable, kind of gets you thinking.
For sure. We're basically tackling three big linked ideas about China. First up, this weird thing with their once-in-a-century disasters.
Woo, why do they seem to pop up almost every year? It's a bit of a head-scratcher.
Totally. It's like, how does that even work? So we'll dig into that first. Then we're shifting gears a bit, getting into some deep social psychology.
Yeah, this whole mentality of you can't live better than me. It's complex.
Definitely uncomfortable territory. And finally, we'll look at why maybe someone else having a good life could actually be seen as, well, a threat to power.
Exactly. How prosperity somewhere else might feel dangerous to a centralized system.
So yeah, get comfy, grab your drink. Let's unpack all of this. Okay, so let's kick it off with what we were calling Schrodinger's disaster.
Yeah, I like that name for it.
Because it's this really bizarre contradiction, right? You keep hearing once in a century this, once in a century that, happening in China.
But then it feels like, wait, didn't we just have one of those last year and the year before?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, how can something be super rare, statistically, but also feel like a regular Tuesday? It just doesn't seem to add up.
It really doesn't on the surface, but the core of it, when you dig into the statistics and how they're used, it comes down to a misunderstanding, or maybe sometimes a deliberate misuse of the term.
Okay, so break that down. What does once in a century actually mean technically?
Right, so statistically, it doesn't mean it happens only once every 100 years, like clockwork. What it really means is there's 1% probability, a 1 in 100 chance of that specific kind of event at that magnitude happening in any given year.
Oh, okay. So it's an annual probability, not a schedule.
Exactly. It's like rolling a 100-sided die every year.
Right. Okay, I get that analogy. You're trying to roll a 1. You have a 1% chance this year, 1% next year, 1% the year after.
Precisely. And just like with a die, you could theoretically roll that 1 2 years in a row. It's unlikely, but possible.
Or you could go 200 years without rolling it at all.
Exactly. It's all about the odds for each specific year, not a guarantee it'll happen neatly spaced out every century.
So when we hear about a city having a once-in-a-century flood, it technically just means that severe flood had a 1% chance of happening that particular year. And, well, it did. The dice roll came up 1.
That's the statistical reality. Which then leads us to the next question. Why does it feel like it's happening way more often than 1% of the time in China?
Yeah, what's making it seem like an annual thing?
Well, one big factor seems to be how the term itself is used, or maybe misused, often by media, sometimes by local officials.
Oh, so?
They might throw around terms like once in a century or 50-year event or even more dramatic ones. And the reason, often it's to, sensationalize it.
Make it sound more epic, more like a huge, unavoidable catastrophe.
Pretty much. It frames it as this overwhelming force of nature, something almost beyond human control or preparedness. It makes for a much more dramatic story.
Okay, I can see that. Unprecedented rainfall sounds way more serious than, yeah, it rained really hard.
Exactly. But the issue is these claims often seem to be more about narrative than hard science.
So you're saying these labels might not always be backed up by, like, solid long-term climate data or proper analysis?
That's what the information suggests. A lot of the time, these declarations might lack that rigorous scientific backing. You need really good long-term data to make a claim like a 140-year event.
Right. You can't just pull that number out of thin air.
But it seems it's sometimes more about shaping how people see the event, managing the public reaction, maybe even
covering tracks a bit.
Well, potentially deflecting some responsibility. We'll get more into that. But another huge piece of this puzzle is China's incredibly rapid urbanization.
Yeah, the city's growing like crazy.
Absolutely massive growth. But the problem is the infrastructure, especially the really basic stuff like drainage systems, hasn't always kept up with that explosive growth.
So it's like you said, building this giant fancy skyscraper, but forgetting to put in big enough pipes for the plumbing.
That's a great way to put it. A lot of these drainage systems, especially in older city parts or areas that grew super fast, were maybe designed for a flood level that used to happen, say, once a decade. or maybe once every 20 years based on older data.
Okay, so standards based on the past, not the present.
Right. So then when you get hit with really extreme weather, which, let's be clear, is happening more often, these older, undersized systems just get completely overwhelmed.
And bam, you've got massive flooding. Streets underwater, subways flooded, people's homes ruined.
Exactly. The impact is way worse because the infrastructure can't handle it. And because the impact is so devastating, the event then gets slapped with that label once in a century.
Even if the rain itself, meteorologically speaking, wasn't quite that rare.
Potentially. It's the combination of heavier rain hitting inadequate infrastructure that creates the century-level disaster feel. The system's failure amplifies the event.
Okay, this is starting to make more sense. But then there's the elephant in the room, right? Climate change.
Absolutely. This is where it gets really critical. We can't ignore the fact that climate change is fundamentally altering weather patterns globally.
We're seeing it everywhere, yeah. More extreme events.
And specifically, extreme rainfall events are becoming more frequent and much more intense in many parts of the world, including China.
So what might have genuinely been a 100-year rainfall event 50 years ago
might now happen every 10 years, or even every 5 years in some places. The baseline has shifted dramatically.
So it's not just mislabeling or bad plumbing, it's that the actual weather is getting wilder.
It is. The analysis really points to this. It's not necessarily that the original century calculation was wrong at the time. It's that the world it was based on doesn't really exist anymore in the same way.
The climate goalposts have moved.
They really have. So relying on historical data alone to define current risk is becoming increasingly problematic. We need models that account for this ongoing change.
Which brings us back to that slightly darker aspect, the idea that sometimes maybe this once-in-a-century label is used deliberately by local governments.
Yeah, this is where it gets a bit murky, maybe even cynical.
Like using it as an excuse to say, hey, this was so huge, so unprecedented, nobody could have possibly prepared for this.
Exactly. It's a narrative that can shift blame. Instead of saying, maybe our planning wasn't adequate or we didn't invest enough in upgrading drainage based on climate predictions, it becomes...
Oh, the heavens opened, an act of God.
Precisely. The heavens were too cruel. It frames it as something utterly beyond human agency, which conveniently deflects questions about preparedness, zoning laws, infrastructure spending.
Right. It manages public anger by suggesting the disaster was just too big to handle.
It's a way to avoid accountability, potentially.
Let's look at that Beijing flood example from 2023.
Yeah.
That really drives this home. Officials called it a 140-year event.
They did. And that immediately raises red flags for anyone thinking critically. First, how much reliable continuous weather data does Beijing actually have going back 140 years to make such a precise statistical claim?
Probably not a perfect, unbroken record, I'm guessing?
It's highly unlikely. Building that kind of long-term, consistent climate record is really hard. But second, and maybe more importantly, let's say their current drainage system was only designed for, hypothetically, a 20-year event. Well, any flood significantly bigger than that, whether it's technically a 50-year storm or 100 or 140, is going to cause massive devastation because the system is overwhelmed way below that claimed 140-year level.
So the impact feels like a super rare catastrophe, regardless of the actual rainfall stats, just because the city wasn't ready for anything much beyond a common heavy storm.
Exactly. There's a huge mismatch between the claimed rarity of the event and the actual level of preparedness on the ground.
Okay, so pulling this all together for this first part, what's the main takeaway? Is it climate change causing these floods? Or is it human factors like bad planning and aging infrastructure?
The analysis really points strongly to it being both, working together in a really destructive way.
A double whammy.
Definitely. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of the rainfall, no doubt about it. We're seeing heavier downpours more often.
No doubt.
But at the same time, the urban planning, the flood defenses, the drainage infrastructure, they just haven't kept up. Not with the changing climate and not with the sheer speed and scale of urbanization.
Too much concrete, not enough drainage, and wilder weather.
That sums it up pretty well. And then you layer on top the role of media and government pronouncements.
Right, using those dramatic labels like once in a century to maybe create this overwhelming sense of disaster.
Which, again, can conveniently shift the focus away from questions about governance, like why wasn't our city better prepared?
So if that's the problem, what would actual solutions look like? What needs to happen?
Well, based on everything we've looked at, a few things seem crucial. First, you need way more transparency and scientific rigor in how disasters are predicted and communicated.
So using real data, real models, not just dramatic labels.
Exactly. Honest assessments based on the best available science. Second, and this is huge, infrastructure standards have to be updated.
Building for the climate we have now and the one we're heading towards, not the one we had 50 years ago.
Precisely. That means investing in better drainage, maybe more green spaces, permeable surfaces, things that manage water better in dense urban areas.
Makes sense.
And finally, just better, more honest communication with the public, helping people understand the real risks and probabilities so they can prepare and hold authorities accountable, rather than just being told it was an unprecedented event every time it floods badly.
Got it. So less sensationalism, more science, and better infrastructure.
That's the ideal, yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up this part, it really does feel like these once-in-a-century disasters in China are almost like those Chinese New Year TV specials.
How so?
Well, you know, they happen every single year. They just have slightly different performers and sketches. It's become this weirdly predictable, unpredictable event.
That's actually a pretty sharp, if maybe a little dark comparison. Okay, let's shift gears now. We're moving from floods and infrastructure to something deeper, more psychological.
Right. This is that second major theme we wanted to explore.
Yeah, it's this really complex social and political dynamic, this mindset that seems to emerge under certain conditions. It's not about wanting the best for everyone or striving for collective improvement. It's darker.
You described it as, since I'm suffering, you shouldn't have it good either.
Exactly. That's the raw sentiment that seems to surface. It's a really unsettling kind of psychology.
Wow. Yeah, that is heavy. It sounds like what psychologists call relative deprivation.
Yeah.
Maybe mixed with a bit of resentment,
Yeah.
or even schadenfreude, like taking pleasure in someone else's problems.
You're hitting the nail on the head. Relative deprivation is a key concept here. And it's important to understand what it means. It's not about being objectively poor or having absolutely nothing.
Okay.
It's about feeling deprived, specifically because you compare yourself to others who seem to have it better. It's that feeling of, I have less than you, and that doesn't feel right or fair.
So it's the comparison that fuels the feeling, not just the absolute situation.
Precisely. It's the gap, and the perception of that gap as unjust.
And how does this play out specifically in the context of China looking towards Taiwan?
Yeah.
Because for many average people in China, daily life can be really tough, right?
It can be incredibly challenging. We're talking about things that grind people down. Sky-high housing costs that make owning a home impossible for many. Wages that don't keep up. The immense pressure and cost of healthcare and education.
Yeah, plus worries about social safety nets, the quality of construction, that whole tofu drag issue you mentioned,
Yeah.
where buildings are poorly made.
Right, and constant anxiety about food safety scandals. All these things create this background hum of stress, frustration, and a feeling that the system isn't fair, that they're working hard but not getting ahead. A deep sense of grievance can build up.
Okay, so you have that baseline of struggle and unfairness.
Exactly. Then these individuals look across the strait at Taiwan, a place with shared language, shared culture, shared history in many ways.
And what do they see?
They see, or at least perceive, a society with things like freedom of speech, actual contested elections where people choose their leaders, a certain level of social stability, better food safety, maybe a lifestyle that seems more open, less stressful in some ways.
And even with China's internet censorship, the Great Firewall, glimpses of that different reality still get through, right?
They do. Information flows, even if it's filtered or partial. People see photos, videos, hear stories from relatives or online, enough to make the comparison.
And that comparison, that visible gap, for some people, it doesn't inspire them. It doesn't make them think, hey, maybe we could have that too.
For some, it seems to trigger the opposite reaction. Instead of aspiration, it sparks resentment, that feeling of, why do they get to live like that when I'm stuck here dealing with all this?
Wow. So it becomes this demand for, like you said, resentful equality. Not lifting everyone up, but maybe pulling the other side down to the same level.
It can manifest that way. It's this psychological imbalance where the perceived unfairness doesn't lead to demands for reform at home, but anger directed at the ones who seem better off. The analysis suggests 3 key things need to be present for this specific reaction.
Okay, what are they?
First, you need a clear group to compare yourself to. In this case, Taiwan fits that bill perfectly culturally similar, geographically close.
Makes sense.
Second, the gap between your situation and theirs needs to be visible and feel significant. The internet, even censored, makes that gap apparent to many.
Got it. And third?
Third, and this is crucial, There needs to be a feeling of powerlessness, a sense that you can't realistically change your own situation for the better within your current system.
So you feel stuck, you see someone else doing better, and you can't fix your own problems. So you get angry at them.
That combination seems to be potent fuel for this kind of resentment. When people feel trapped and hopeless about their own prospects, that frustration has to go somewhere.
And it gets projected outwards, onto those perceived as having it easier.
It's a common psychological defense mechanism, yes. Displacing that anger onto an external target can feel easier or safer than confronting the source of the frustration directly, especially if that source is powerful or systemic.
So it's kind of like historical class hatred, but maybe not strictly about money.
Right. It's less about Taiwan being rich, per se, and more about them being seen as system beneficiaries, people who benefit from a different, perhaps fairer or freer system.
And the thought process becomes something like, you Taiwanese look down on us, you talk about our problems. Maybe you deserve some problems too.
That's the kind of sentiment that can emerge. A desire for shared misery almost, as a twisted form of fairness. A leveling down, not a lifting up.
Which then completely twists the idea of unification. For people feeling this resentment, what does unification even mean? It's clearly not about shared prosperity.
No, the vision becomes much darker. It's not about building a better future together. It can morph into thoughts like...
Like what?
Like, if I have to suffer, then you should suffer too. That's only fair. Or, more aggressively, you talk so much about your democracy and freedom. Let's see how you like it under our system after unification.
Oof. Or even, you think you can mock China now. Just wait until we're unified. You won't be so smug then.
Exactly. It becomes about control, about dominance, about silencing the other side, about forcing them down to your level. It's a nationalism rooted in revenge, not aspiration.
That's a really chilling perspective on nationalism. Not pride, but punishment.
It's a destructive impulse. And this whole mindset, according to the analysis, gets heavily amplified by the information environment in China.
The censorship, the propaganda.
Absolutely. Think about platforms like Weibo or Douyin. They're tightly controlled. You see accounts deliberately posting content designed to make Taiwan look bad, exaggerating problems, showing unflattering images, maybe even fabricating comparisons.
Like showing rundown parts of Taipei next to gleaming new buildings in Shanghai.
Exactly. Or highlighting any social unrest or political argument in Taiwan to paint it as chaotic, while ignoring similar or worse issues at home. It's all designed to fuel that narrative. See? They're not so great after all. They don't deserve to be better off.
And then you add the decades of official education.
Right. From a young age, the message is relentless. Taiwan is part of China. Taiwanese independence is pushed by hostile foreign forces. Opposing unification is betraying the motherland.
So people internalize this idea that if Taiwan doesn't want to unify, they're essentially enemies or traitors.
For some, yes. It creates this framework where opposing the CCP's line on Taiwan isn't just a political difference, it's a moral failing, an act of hostility, and that justifies anger, resentment, even a desire to suppress them.
So, just to sum up this part, the hostility we sometimes see isn't necessarily about Taiwan itself, but it's born from this twisted sense of equality born from despair.
That captures it well. It's the despair about their own situation being projected outwards. Supporting unification for these individuals isn't about wishing Taiwan well. It's about wanting Taiwan to be dragged down to their level to eliminate that painful comparison.
It really boils down to that raw feeling. If I'm stuck in the mud, you shouldn't get to stand on the clean shore.
That's the essence of it. A deeply human but ultimately destructive psychological reaction.
And you mentioned this gets triggered even more by Taiwan's identity polling.
Hugely. When the data comes out showing that only, say, 3% of Taiwanese people identify solely as Chinese.
Only 3%.
For someone steeped in the one China narrative, someone perhaps already feeling that relative deprivation, that number is more than just disappointing. It feels like a slap in the face.
A betrayal. A humiliation.
All of the above. It shatters the whole idea of a unified Chinese identity waiting to be restored. It feels like rejection on a national, even personal level. And that can be unbearable.
And the reaction isn't reflection, it's lashing out.
Often, yes. The cognitive dissonance is too strong. They can't easily process. Maybe they just don't want to be part of our country. So the anger surges. Who do you think you are? Forgetting your ancestors, you were just colonized. You need to be taught a lesson.
So unification then becomes a fantasy about forcing compliance.
Exactly. Making them shut up, making them kneel, making them say, I am Chinese. It's about imposing identity and restoring a perceived wounded national pride through force. The analysis even outlined 4 key traits of this specific psychology.
Okay, what are they? Let's tick them off.
First, compensatory superiority. Basically, my life might suck, but my country is big and powerful, and your island is small, so you have no right to act proud.
Using nationalism to feel better about personal struggles.
Got it.
Second,
Projected anger. The real source of their pain might be their own system, but they can't safely criticize that, so they dump all that anger onto Taiwan instead.
makes sense. Third,
Desire for control and identity anxiety. That desperate need. You must say you're Chinese because if you don't, it makes me question who I am.
wow, that's deep. And fourth,
Interclass animosity or same origin revenge. They're scared to punch up at their own elites or government, so they want to drag down someone culturally similar, like Taiwan, who seems to have escaped their fate.
pulling them back into the crab bucket, basically.
That's a grim but fitting analogy. And just to put numbers on the identity part again, Taiwan surveys show 60-65% identify only as Taiwanese, about 30% as both, and just that tiny 2-3% as only Chinese.
Those numbers really starkly illustrate why this is such a sensitive point for mainland nationalists. It completely undermines the "we're all one family just waiting to reunite" story.
It absolutely does. And for those susceptible to that resentful mindset, the only answer seems to become, fine. If you won't join willingly, we'll conquer you and make you like us.
So the big takeaway for listeners on this part, Taiwan acts like a really cruel mirror for certain people in China.
That's a powerful way to think about it. Its existence reflects back things that are hard to face.
Like the freedoms, the democracy, the healthcare over there. They aren't seen as something to maybe learn from, but as a constant, painful reminder of what's missing at home.
Exactly. It makes it harder to just tell yourself, everything's fine here, our system is the best. That mirror forces an uncomfortable comparison.
And the tragic thing is, when people feel powerless to change their own situation, instead of striving upwards, the impulse can be to just smash the mirror.
Yeah.
To destroy the thing that makes them feel bad.
It's a deeply concerning psychological dynamic with huge geopolitical implications.
Okay, let's move to the third major point. This one shifts perspective to the CCP, to Beijing's view. What's their core fear when it comes to Taiwan?
Well, it's probably not what most people immediately think of, like a military invasion from Taiwan or direct economic rivalry. Those are factors maybe, but not the core fear.
So what is it then?
The analysis suggests the real fundamental fear is much more ideological. It's that Taiwan exists as a living, functioning proof of concept.
Proof of what?
Proof that Chinese people sharing the same broad cultural background can live freely, can participate in democracy, can have a stable, prosperous society without authoritarian control and without falling into chaos.
So Taiwan's success is a direct challenge to the CCP's whole justification for its own power.
Exactly. It fundamentally undermines the CCP's claim that their strict control is necessary for China's stability and progress. Taiwan's mere existence is a counter-narrative that walks and talks.
So it's not just pride for Taiwan, it's actually, from the CCP's perspective, a major existential threat.
In a very real ideological sense, yes. Because think about the CCP's core narrative, hammered home for decades.
What's that narrative again?
It's basically, China is too big, too complex, too unique. If we had democracy like the West, it would be total chaos. Only the strong guiding hand of the Communist Party can keep this huge country stable and moving forward.
Right, that's the line, order versus chaos.
But then you have Taiwan. Same language, largely shared culture and history, and it completely blows that argument out of the water.
How so?
Because Taiwan demonstrates day in and day out that you don't need constant party indoctrination for social stability, that a free press doesn't automatically destroy the country, that having different political parties compete for power doesn't lead to civil war, that things like free speech and independent courts actually build trust and make society stronger, not weaker.
So Taiwan is basically a living refutation of the CCP's biggest lie.
You could definitely put it that way. It shows that the supposed choice between CCP rule and chaos is a false dichotomy. There's another option, and it seems to work pretty well for people who look and sound just like mainland Chinese.
Okay, so if that's the case, why is the idea of a democratic China, inspired by Taiwan, so terrifying to the CCP?
Yeah.
What would happen from their point of view?
Well, if ordinary Chinese citizens start genuinely believing, hey, maybe we could elect our own leaders, or maybe we should be able to criticize the government safely like they do in Taiwan, then things get dangerous for the party.
How? What changes?
First, Party officials lose their special status. They're no longer seen as wise, infallible leaders, but as public servants who need to be watched and held accountable. Their power base erodes.
Okay.
Second, that core equation, nation party, starts to fall apart. The slogan, "Without the Communist Party, there is no new China," gets challenged by the reality of Taiwan, which suggests without the Communist Party, maybe there's a better Chinese life.
That's a huge ideological blow.
Massive. And third, people would start demanding real change, not just voting, but maybe asking for independent courts, a free press, rules for impeaching corrupt officials, basically demanding the checks and balances that limit unaccountable power.
Which is the last thing an authoritarian party wants.
Absolutely. It's a direct challenge to their monopoly on power. So naturally, they have strategies to suppress this Taiwan is proof democracy works narrative.
What kind of strategies? You mentioned three main ones.
Right. The first is pretty straightforward. Information blockade.
The Great Firewall, censoring Taiwanese news.
Exactly. Preventing Taiwanese TV shows, news websites, any positive portrayal of Taiwan's system from reaching the mainland audience easily, and heavily censoring discussion about it on Chinese platforms like Weibo and Douyin.
But it's not just blocking, it's also pushing negative stuff, right?
Yes, absolutely. Actively spreading misinformation. Taiwan is chaotic. Taiwanese democracy is a joke. Their economy is failing. Elections are all corrupt. Anything to make the Taiwanese model look unattractive and dysfunctional.
Okay, so control the information flow. What's the second strategy?
Language warfare. This is about controlling the meaning of words, specifically democracy.
How do they do that?
They deliberately frame democracy as something negative. It's always depicted as chaotic, inefficient, divisive, leading to endless arguments and gridlock.
They'll point to problems in Western democracies.
Constantly. Look how messy America is. Look at the Hong Kong protests. That's what democracy brings. Taiwan's politicians just fight all day. The goal is to define democracy as a Western trap that's fundamentally unsuited for China, something dangerous.
So poison the well of the word itself.
Precisely. Make people scared of the very idea. And the third strategy.
Political suppression, using unification as the lever.
Right. They shift the whole conversation. It's not allowed to be about which system, Taiwan's or the mainland's, actually serves the people better.
Instead, it has to be about
only about one China. National unity, patriotism, any positive comment about Taiwan's system, any suggestion that maybe the mainland could learn something gets instantly reframed as being unpatriotic, splittist, even treasonous.
Wow. So appreciating freedom elsewhere becomes betraying your own country.
It's a very effective way to shut down debate and enforce conformity. You use nationalism to squash any discussion of political alternatives.
So given all this, the censorship, the propaganda, the suppression, do average Chinese people actually want democracy? Or have they bought the official line that it's not for them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The state media constantly says Chinese people don't want Western democracy. But the evidence we see suggests it's much more complicated. There's definitely curiosity.
How do we know?
Well, think about the huge numbers of people who actively use VPNs to get around the Great Firewall just to read uncensored news and talk about forbidden topics. That takes effort and risk.
True.
And look at what happens when there's a major scandal, a corrupt official exposed, maybe information about a disaster covered up. You often see an explosion of online anger and discussion pushing right up against the limits of censorship. People do demand accountability.
And we saw things like the white paper protests against the zero COVID policies.
Exactly. Those were explicit demands for freedom, for an end to arbitrary lockdowns, for basic rights. People risk a lot to make those demands heard. It showed a real hunger for agency and accountability.
So maybe it's not that they don't want more freedom or democracy.
It's more likely that living under a system with harsh, unpredictable punishments for dissent makes it incredibly dangerous to ask for it openly. You can't just start a petition or organize a rally without risking severe consequences.
It's a rational fear in an environment designed to create fear.
Precisely. So they might not talk about it openly, but Taiwan's existence constantly serves as that quiet, persistent proof. Chinese people can handle democracy, can thrive in freedom, and arguably deserve it.
So wrapping up this third part, Taiwan's real significance, its real power in this whole dynamic, isn't its army or its economy.
No. Its greatest value, from this perspective, is that it shatters the CCP's most fundamental superstition, the idea that Chinese people need authoritarian rule to avoid chaos.
Taiwan just it is.
Yeah.
And by being a functioning democracy, it tells the world.
It tells the world Without the Communist Party, Chinese people can live civilized, free, normal, productive lives.
And that message, just by existing, is the most subversive thing imaginable to the CCP's hold on power.
Absolutely. It challenges the very foundation of their legitimacy.
Okay, but now we need to add some nuance, right? Because
Sure.
we've talked a lot about this resentment and hostility, but it's not the whole picture when it comes to mainland attitudes towards Taiwan.
Absolutely vital point. It's really easy to paint with a broad brush, but the reality, as the information shows, is much more diverse. Not every single person in China, especially not every working class person, feels that intense "you can't live better than me" resentment towards Taiwan.
Right. That relative deprivation thing might fuel some views,
Yeah.
but it's definitely not the only driver. There are other reasons people might support unification or just feel differently.
For sure. One major factor is simply cultural and historical identity.
How does that play out?
Many people genuinely support unification just because they've been taught their whole lives and deeply believe that both sides of the strait belong to one China. It's about history, culture, shared ancestry.
So less about hating Taiwan's system, more about feeling a sense of, like, historical completeness if unification happened.
Exactly. It comes from that patriotic education, the official narrative emphasizing cultural bonds. For these people, it's not driven by jealousy, but by a sense of national destiny or restoring perceived historical integrity.
Okay, that makes sense. What else? Are there more, like, pragmatic reasons?
Yeah, some people might look at it from a more hard-nosed perspective. They might see unification bringing tangible benefits to China, maybe boosting its international standing, its geopolitical clout, or even creating economic advantages.
So more about national power and strategy, less about personal feelings towards Taiwan.
Right, a more calculated view based on perceived national interest rather than a desire to see Taiwan suffer.
And then there's just indifference, people who don't really care that much.
That's a huge group, especially now. When people are really struggling with their own economic problems, finding a job, paying the mortgage, just getting by day to day, the whole Taiwan issue can feel very distant and abstract.
Their focus is just survival, not cross-strait politics.
Exactly. Animosity towards Taiwan isn't really on their mind when they're worried about their next paycheck or the roof over their head.
And this ties into the current economic situation in China, which seems to be shifting attitudes.
Definitely. The information strongly suggests that the economic slowdown, the high youth unemployment, the property crisis is making a lot of people rethink priorities.
Like, maybe unifying Taiwan isn't the most urgent issue when the domestic economy feels shaky.
Precisely. You see more chatter online, even filtering through censorship, saying things like, shouldn't we fix our own problems first? Or jobs and stability at home are more important right now.
So the economic pain might actually be diluting some of that nationalistic fervor or resentment.
It seems plausible. When immediate survival is the main concern, abstract goals like unification can lose their appeal. Relative deprivation might even turn inward.
I mean,
Instead of resenting Taiwan for being better off, people might start resenting the rich within China, or even quietly blaming the government for the economic hardship. That shifts the focus away from Taiwan.
we kind of saw hints of this during the 2024 Taiwan election, didn't we?
Yeah, that was fascinating. Despite the usual propaganda, there were real discussions on Chinese social media. People weren't just hostile. Some were genuinely curious, even commenting things like, wow, look how they vote, or asking, why can't we do that?
So less automatic hostility, more observation. Maybe even a little envy of the process, not just resentment.
It showed a crack in the usual narrative. When people are feeling economic pressure, they might be more open to questioning things, or at least less invested in outward aggression. The drag Taiwan down motive might weaken when you're just trying to stay afloat yourself.
Of course, the information environment still plays a huge role in shaping what people know or think they know about Taiwan.
Absolutely. The censorship is real. The propaganda is pervasive. Many people's views are formed by that filtered reality.
Doing showing Taiwan in a bad light, state media pushing negative stories.
Right. But, as we noted, some people do get access to real information via VPNs. And what's interesting is that sometimes this leads to admiration, not hatred.
People seeing Taiwan's democracy or free speech and thinking, hey, that looks pretty good.
Exactly, which is the total opposite of the resentment narrative. It shows that access to information can genuinely change perspectives. That 2024 election transparency seemed to spark some real reflection for some mainlanders, like, Maybe that's a better way.
And Taiwan's own stance matters too, obviously. Their consistent opposition to unification.
That definitely fuels hostility among the hardline nationalists in China, no doubt. They see it as defiance. But for others, it might just make them pause and think, wait, if they really don't want this, maybe the official story isn't quite right.
And Taiwan just continuing to function as a stable democracy.
Might make some people think, see, it is possible for Chinese people to live like that, which, again, subtly chips away at the idea that authoritarianism is the only way, and maybe reduces the resentment born from perceived impossibility.
So let's recap some numbers quickly, just to keep things grounded.
Yeah.
In China, support for forceful unification was around 55% in a 2023 survey.
Right, but crucially, other options like sanctions or just keeping the status quo also had significant support. It wasn't like everyone was demanding invasion. It shows a range of opinions.
And in Taiwan, it's overwhelmingly pro-status quo, right? Like over 80% in 2024.
Yes, a huge majority want things to stay as they are, at least for now. And about 63% had a negative view of the PRC government.
So these numbers really highlight the gap. There's support for unification in China, driven by various factors, including nationalism. But Taiwan's population clearly wants a different path. It's a fundamental clash.
So pulling all these threads together for our final thoughts, the attitudes in China towards Taiwan are just not simple. They're not monolithic.
Definitely not just one thing. It's this messy mix of
How?
cultural identity, economic anxiety,
Right.
the information people get, their personal lives.
Exactly. And yes, that resentment from relative deprivation is absolutely real for some people, but it's clearly not the whole story. It doesn't explain everyone's views.
Yeah, and it feels like things are shifting too. With China's economy facing headwinds and maybe more real images of Taiwan filtering through, maybe those more hostile feelings will lessen over time.
It's possible. Economic reality has a way of focusing minds on domestic issues, and the more people see of Taiwan's actual society, the harder it might be to maintain pure hostility based on propaganda. It's definitely a complex, evolving situation full of different layers and viewpoints.
Which is why we love digging into this stuff here on Sip and Talk, trying to get past the easy headlines and see the complexity underneath.
Exactly, helping you navigate these fascinating, sometimes tricky topics, and hopefully see the bigger, more nuanced picture based on the information out there. Thanks so much for joining us for this discussion.
Yeah, thanks for sipping on some knowledge with us. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do hit that subscribe button for Sip and Talk on whatever app you use for your podcasts.
Please do.
And hey, seriously, while you're doing that, you have got to check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. It's called Micky to Life.
Oh yeah, Micky's great.
He does awesome stuff, funny memes, really cool music finds, wine tasting, travel vlogs, just really fun content. Definitely go look him up, Micky to Life on YouTube.
You won't regret it. It's a guaranteed good time. So, until our next Sip and Talk.
Just curious.